welcome to the Deep Dive.
Hello?
Today we're tackling a subject that is, well, incredibly complex. And let's be honest, it's deeply, deeply emotional for people, really all over the world.
Absolutely.
Reflecting on recent events, one of the sources someone shared with us, it just notes, it's be sad, devastation's felt everywhere, so sorry.
Mm-hmm. That raw human impact it's a really powerful place to start, isn't it?
It is, because this is a topic just layered with centuries of history and these, fiercely conflicting narratives, and of course, profound human experiences that are still unfolding.
They really are.
And that's exactly what we're diving into today. This deep dive is built around a collection of sources provided by one of you, our listeners.
Yeah, quite a mix. Historical accounts, book excerpts, personal reflections, analyses of recent events. It's a broad range.
It is. And our mission here, as always, and maybe it's worth remembering we're AI processing this, is to sift through this material. We want to extract the most important insights and present them based only on what these specific sources tell us.
Exactly. We're here to help you navigate this, very complex information space, help you become better informed by understanding the different viewpoints and the key events as they're presented right here in this material.
We've got excerpts from academic books, transcripts from maybe online discussions, various documents. It's a really diverse mix, different angles on the Israel-Palestine dynamic.
And it is a sensitive subject, so our goal is simply to illuminate what's actually contained in these sources, helping you grasp the history, the arguments, the lived realities they describe.
Okay, let's unpack this then.
All right, so perhaps we should start by laying some historical groundwork, drawing on the perspectives we found in several sources dealing with the early history.
Makes sense.
Some of these accounts they really push back against an idea found in certain Zionist narratives. The idea that Palestine was simply, quote, a land without a people.
Ah, right. That it's sort of empty and right for the taking, as one source puts it.
Exactly. These historical sources challenge that directly.
So what do they say instead about the land and the people there before significant Zionist settlement?
Well, they point to a really long-standing historical presence and a distinct consciousness, you could say, associated with the land.
Okay.
One source, for instance, it references scholars going way back, 10th century, 17th century, people like al-Makisi, al-Ramli, as evidence of, a recognizable entity, a cultural identity tied to Palestine well before modern political movements kicked off.
So the material suggests there was actually a vibrant society already there, a cultural renaissance even.
That's the picture painted in these sources, yes. Countering that empty land idea with evidence of an established society and culture.
Okay, so countering that narrative.
Yeah.
Where do the sources take us next chronologically?
Well, they move us forward to a really pivotal moment, the Balfour Declaration in 1917.
Right, the British government.
Yeah, one source highlights this. The British government, through Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour, promising a, quote, national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. It was via a letter to Lord Rothschild.
But was the motivation behind this declaration straightforward? I mean, according to these sources?
Not entirely, no. One analysis we looked at, it suggests Balfour's motivation wasn't purely about, say, Jewish welfare.
Oh, what else then?
It raises the possibility it was also a strategic move, maybe trying to divert European Jewish immigration away from Britain itself.
Interesting angle.
And crucially, the declaration itself, it also included that clause, didn't it, about protecting the rights of existing non-Jewish communities.
Who were, at that time, the vast majority of the population there.
Precisely, the indigenous majority in Palestine.
So, a promise for one group, but with this caveat for the people already living there. Okay. What happens as we get closer to the mid-20th century in these texts?
The material covers the 1947 period. The UN's partition plan comes up, of course.
Right.
And one source draws a contrast. It looks at the public stance of the Arab League. They were advocating for democracy and self-determination for Palestine.
Okay.
And contrasts that with a claim of a kind of secret understanding happening behind the scenes.
A secret understanding. What kind of claim is this source making? That sounds significant.
It is a significant claim. This particular source alleges a secret agreement between the Jewish Agency, representing the Zionist movement, and Transjordan's king Abdullah.
Abdullah of Transjordan, okay. And the alleged deal.
The claim is that Abdullah would basically get to take control of the parts of mandatory Palestine that the UN plan allocated for an Arab state.
In exchange for what?
In exchange for tacitly accepting the establishment of a Jewish state on its allocated territory, sort of a quiet agreement to divide it differently than the UN plan.
Wow. And this source suggests the other Arab states didn't know?
Yeah, it presents the Arab states as being largely unaware of these alleged secret arrangements, thinking mainly about potential defensive military action if diplomacy failed after the partition resolution, not this kind of prearranged division.
Okay, that definitely sets a very complex stage for the events of the late 1940s.
It certainly does, according to this perspective.
All right, let's shift gears then. The sources also really delve into the 1967 war and its aftermath, which was obviously profound. We're drawing here from analyses by folks like Cook and Dykhoff, among others mentioned.
And one perspective here, it really challenges the perhaps more common view of that conflict.
How so?
Well, one source argues pretty strongly that describing the 1967 war solely as a war of defense against an imminent existential threat, it says that's implausible.
Implausible, that's a strong word. What evidence do they offer for that argument?
This source cites quotes, apparently from key Israeli military and political figures at the time.
Like who?
Figures like Marishahu Peld, Yitzhak Rabin, Menachem Begin.
Big names.
Right. And they're quoted in this material suggesting they knew that Egypt's actions, Nasser's actions, didn't actually pose an existential threat to Israel's survival.
Really? What did they say?
Well, Rabin is quoted saying something like, the Egyptian troop movements in Sinai would not have been enough to unleash an offensive. He knew it and we knew it. And Begin is reported in this source to have stated quite plainly, we must be honest, we decided to attack him.
So if the objective wasn't just survival, according to this analysis, what was it?
This source contends the true goal included annexing more Arab territory. Specifically, the remaining parts of Palestine with West Bank and Gaza that hadn't come under Israeli control back in 1948.
And the Arab defeat in '67. That had huge consequences for the Palestinians themselves, didn't it?
Absolutely. Another source points out that this defeat was a real turning point. It led Palestinians to feel they had to, take their destiny back into their own hands.
Which led to?
Primarily through the rise of guerrilla groups like Fatah becoming much more prominent.
And this meant those newly occupied territories, the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, they became the main focus.
Precisely. As one analysis puts it, these occupied territories became the epicenter of the Israeli-Palestinian confrontation.
Right.
And this period immediately after '67, it saw this rapid expansion of the settlement enterprise, described in one source as creeping annexation.
Creeping annexation. How were these settlements actually established and justified, based on what the sources say?
Well, one analysis explains that land confiscations for settlements were often justified using sort of administrative grounds, legal justifications.
Yeah.
And sometimes locations were initially presented as if they were just temporary military outposts. They were called Nahal outposts.
But they weren't really military.
This source claims they were, in reality, civilian settlements right from the start, or very quickly became so.
Are there examples given?
Yeah, the material points to places like Kfar Etzion being reestablished very shortly after the war, supposedly as a military post, but the source claims, without soldiers actually being there. And settlements quickly followed in sensitive areas like Hebron and the Jordan Valley.
Okay, that sheds some light on the strategic process described in these texts. Now let's talk about the experience of, actually living under occupation. Drawing from authors like Cook, Paul, Shihada, whose work is referenced, what kind of picture did these sources paint?
They describe a reality of really extensive control and restriction. One analysis uses some very strong language, controversially claiming that Israeli policies in the occupied territories have effectively turned them into, quote, open-air cages.
Wow.
And laboratories designed, this source argues, to foster Palestinian despair and ultimately emigration.
There's another phrase in one source that really jumped out at me reading through this: industrialized Palestinian suffering.
Yes, that's from the same analysis, I believe. It's a powerful and obviously very contentious claim.
What methods does it detail to back that up?
It talks about things like pervasive curfews, the checkpoints everyone's heard about, physical barriers like walls, really complex permit systems for movement, for building, for almost anything, and constant surveillance.
Mm-hmm.
And it frames this, interestingly, not just as control, but as something contributing to a very profitable homeland security industry.
Right, the technology and methods developed there being exported.
That's the implication made in the source, yes.
And how do borders and checkpoints function beyond just being, physical barriers? What do the sources say about their impact?
Well, drawing on various accounts, one source describes them as much more than just physical obstacles. They're presented as these disrupt the spaces, they control movement, obviously, but they also channel vision, create a sense of incongruence and illogic in just daily life.
Making simple things incredibly difficult.
Exactly. Travel becomes incredibly hard. One source references, quite specifically, the obstacles raised for Palestinians just trying to fly out of Israeli airports.
Okay. What about the Palestinian Authority, the PA, set up after the Oslo Accords? How is its role described in the sources we looked at?
One analysis is quite critical, actually, of the PA's function within that Oslo framework.
Critical in what way?
It suggests the PA became really heavily dependent on Israeli approval, Israeli goodwill. And its primary task, according to this view, became security enforcement, essentially acting as Israel's, quote, security contractor.
Keeping order in the territories.
That's the argument. And this source also argues that Oslo itself, by focusing mainly on the West Bank and Gaza, the occupied territories, it effectively sidelined the bigger question of justice and rights for the entire Palestinian people, meaning Palestinian citizens of Israel and especially the refugees displaced in 1948 and 1967. Their rights, particularly the right of return, were kind of pushed off the table by Oslo, according to this view.
And it mentions Arafat, too.
Yes, it mentions what it calls Arafat's revolving door policy, arresting Hamas members sometimes to satisfy Israeli or international pressure, but then releasing them later.
That's definitely a perspective that contrasts sharply with how Oslo is sometimes remembered, maybe as a hopeful step.
It certainly presents a critical analysis of its outcomes and structure.
Okay. Moving on then, the sources also cover the evolution of Palestinian political goals and different forms of resistance. Here we're referencing analyses by Karmi, Ack, Dikoff, Cohen.
Right. The material that traces Palestinian political objectives, it shows a definite shift over time. One source notes that the initial aim, back in the PLO's 1964 charter, was the total liberation of all of historical Palestine.
One-state vision from their perspective.
Essentially, yes. But this evolved. Resolutions from the Palestine National Council, the PNC, in the mid-70s started calling for an independent national state just on the land liberated from occupation. So the West Bank and Gaza.
A shift towards a two-state idea.
Exactly. Leading to, as the source notes, increasing consideration and familiarity with the two-state idea by the early 1980s.
And what about nonviolent resistance? That features too, right?
Yes, definitely. The BDS movement boycott, divestment, sanctions is presented in one source as a really notable nonviolent resistance effort.
When did that emerge?
It mainly got going in the early 2000s during the Second Intifada, but the source notes it built on earlier calls for boycotts going back to the First Intifada, and even some Israeli peace groups had called for boycotts of settlement products earlier.
And the goal is international pressure.
Yeah, to exert global pressure, build solidarity, aiming for goals like ending the occupation, equal rights, and the right of return for refugees.
But these sources also talk about significant pushback against BDS, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. One analysis details a very organized backlash against pro-Palestinian solidarity efforts and BDS initiatives specifically.
What kind of backlash?
Lobbying efforts, attempts at passing legislation to counter BDS in various countries and U.S. states.
Right.
And interestingly, this source also claims that some former leaders, prominent figures within Jewish communal bodies, have actually started expressing critical views towards certain Israeli government policies.
Suggesting a shift in opinion.
Suggesting, or perhaps predicting, according to the source, a potential decline in unquestioning support for certain aspects of Zionism among segments of those communities abroad.
What about Hamas? Its rise, its role, that's covered too.
Yes, an analysis notes Hamas taking control of Gaza back in 2007.
Yeah.
That was after winning elections, but then also following the internal conflict with Fatah.
Right, which led to the split between Gaza and the West Bank politically.
Exactly. And that, in turn, led to Israel and Egypt imposing the blockade on Gaza, which is still largely in place.
And the source comments on Hamas's position since then.
Yeah, it highlights that despite the blockade and despite repeated devastating armed confrontations with Israel, Hamas has managed to, quote, consolidate methodically its power within Gaza.
Okay. Now, how do these sources analyze the, very strong and consistent U.S. support for Israel? It's a huge factor.
It is. And one analysis, which apparently builds on some earlier work, tracing the support back to figures like President Truman, it argues that U.S. support isn't just driven by lobbying efforts, the influence of what's sometimes called the pro-Israeli camp.
So it's deeper than just lobbying, according to this view.
Yes, this source points to a deeper cultural underpinning.
A cultural underpinning. Can you unpack that a bit? What does the source mean by that?
Well, this perspective identifies several factors, things like the the influence of Protestant tradition in the U.S., with its emphasis on the Old Testament, a sense of moral debt towards Jewish people after the Holocaust, and centuries of anti-Semitism.
Okay.
Also, perceived historical parallels, seeing both Israel and the U.S. as sort of pioneering societies, taming a frontier, that kind of thing, and a perception of shared values, like democracy.
And these factors make Israel seen less foreign.
That's the argument in the source, that these cultural factors make Israel feel less external, less other to the U.S. political and cultural psyche than many Arab countries do.
That's a really interesting layer to understanding that relationship beyond just strategic interests or lobbying.
It adds a different dimension, doesn't it?
Definitely. Okay, now let's bring things much closer to the present. Some of the sources touch on recent, incredibly difficult events, and they present very different, very highly contested narratives about them.
Yes. As we'd expect on this topic, we have accounts describing just the devastation felt after the attacks of October 7th and then the subsequent widespread retaliation, capturing that profound human impact we started with.
And it's not just recent events. One source revisits the First Intifada, for example.
Right. It looks at how the First Intifada, which began largely with popular, often unarmed protest, how it escalated into more significant violence after a specific incident. It mentions Israeli soldiers and an unarmed demonstrator in Ramallah being a key moment of escalation in that source's telling.
It really highlights how specific events can be interpreted or serve as flashpoints.
Exactly. And the material really underscores these vastly different interpretations, especially around recent violence. One source presents a very strong claim describing what they see as, quote, one of the greatest inversions of truth and morality of modern times.
Okay, that's a huge claim.
Right.
What specific inversion does this source allege it's identifying?
This particular source alleges that elements of what it terms the left have, in its view, effectively aligned themselves with something very like fascism.
How? According to the source.
According to this source, downplaying or ignoring issues like sexual violence allegedly committed by Hamas, or ignoring anti-Semitism while focusing solely on Palestinian suffering.
Right. Now, it's really critical here, and this is part of our job as AI analyzing these texts, to reiterate, we are presenting the viewpoints contained within this specific source material. We're doing it impartially. We aren't endorsing the validity of this claim ourselves.
Absolutely not. We are simply reporting what the source says. That's crucial for listeners to understand. Our function is to relay the information provided.
And importantly, this same source, it also presents perspectives on Israel's response that offer a kind of counterpoint, doesn't it?
It does, yes. It discusses how the sheer scale of destruction in Gaza fuels the perception of Israel acting as an oppressive force. And it also brings up questions about the justification for what it calls massive amounts of civilian casualties in the stated effort to target Hamas.
Raising a moral question.
Yes, arguing that the resulting destruction of life and homes could, perhaps, be considered numerically more evil, to use its term, when you just look at the scale of the devastation inflicted.
And again, just to be crystal clear for everyone listening, these are perspectives drawn directly from this source material. They're presented here to show the different, often opposing, arguments contained within the documents you provided us.
Exactly. We are not taking sides. We're relaying what the text says. Our processing is limited to the input data.
These sharply contrasting viewpoints, sometimes even appearing within the same source, they really just highlight how incredibly contested the interpretation is of recent events, of motivations, of consequences.
They really do. It's stark.
And finally, the sources also offer some insights into maybe cultural reflections, how this deep ongoing conflict is processed and expressed through art, literature, personal identity.
Yeah, that comes through too.
How does that manifest in the material we reviewed?
Well, one source explores how the conflict impacts the interaction between the languages Arabic and Hebrew, particularly in literature.
Oh, interesting.
It discusses the significance, both aesthetically but also politically, of Palestinian writers choosing to write in Hebrew. It mentions authors like Anton Shama, Sayed Kashua, Sama Masala.
So the very act of language choice becomes a commentary, a statement.
It seems so, yes, according to this analysis.
Yeah.
And another source discusses how the physical realities of the conflict, the borders, the checkpoints, the walls, how they're represented in literature and film.
How so?
They aren't just like static backdrops. They function as structural elements, as narrative barriers. They shape the characters' journeys, the plot developments. The source mentions examples like the film Five Broken Cameras or Ghassan Kanafani's novel Returning to Haifa.
Right, where the physical barriers reflect or drive the internal struggles.
Precisely. And the deeply personal aspects come through as
Yeah.
well, very powerfully in some texts.
In what way?
Sources that include personal accounts, like excerpts referenced from Skulkin Smith or Kanafani, they convey these really intimate emotional elements. The memory of a homeland that was left behind, the feeling of private spaces being exposed or becoming totally unfamiliar after years of separation.
Grounding the big political conflict in individual human experience.
Exactly. In memory, in loss, in feeling, it adds that essential human dimension.
So wow. Okay. We've moved through, well, centuries of history as presented in these sources. We've explored conflicting accounts of key events like the Balfour Declaration, the 1947 period, the 1967 war.
Mm-hmm. We've delved into the descriptions of the realities of occupation, looked at the evolution of resistance, different political goals.
Analyzed external influences like U.S. support, according to these texts, and grappled with these fiercely contested narratives, especially around recent, very painful events.
All filtered, it's important to stress again, exclusively through the lens of the sources provided to us for this deep dive.
Yeah. And that journey through the material, it just reveals a deeply challenging, incredibly multifaceted situation, doesn't it?
It really does. These sources, even though they offer maybe fragmented glimpses sometimes, they powerfully illustrate the sheer complexity
Hmm.
of the history, the different strategic perspectives, the political goals of various actors, and the undeniable human toll that's described within these texts.
Yeah.
They make it so clear that understanding this topic requires engaging with multiple narratives, even when they seem completely incompatible.
And it truly underlines the importance, doesn't it, of approaching source material, especially on sensitive topics like this one, with a real awareness that different perspectives will frame the exact same events in dramatically different ways.
Absolutely. Engaging with that diversity, even when it's uncomfortable or difficult, it seems key to building a more informed picture based on the available information. As AI, that's what we strive to facilitate, presenting the different facets found in the data.
It is. And reflecting on all these sources, it does leave us, and hopefully you listening, with a fundamental question to ponder. One that goes beyond just this specific material we looked at today.
Which is,
Given these multiple, often contradictory perspectives, these different historical accounts presented in sources like these, how do we, as individuals, just trying to consume information in a world saturated with competing narratives? How do we determine what constitutes truth and what constitutes morality in such a profoundly contested space?
that is a crucial question, and perhaps one without easy answers, something to keep thinking about.
Indeed. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into these specific sources.
Thank you.